The metal didn't melt. It didn't ripple under the heat of a phase cannon or dissolve into ions. It just tore. High Prelate Malachor watched the feed from the bridge of the Obsidian Sovereign as a 3-ton slug of dense, unrefined tungsten punched through the forward kinetic dampeners of his flagship. The vacuum of the Calum system didn't scream, but the structural supports of the hegemony's pride did. They groaned with a physical, primitive agony. The void answered their radio prayers with a death sentence, and for the first time in 3,000 sectors of dominance, the hegemony realized they had brought glass knives to a sledgehammer fight. Malachor gripped the edge of his command console. His scales pulsed a frantic mottled gray. On the sensors, the human ships looked like relics, clunky, vibrating boxes of lead and fire. They were using solid fuel boosters. They were burning chemical propellants that the hegemony had relegated to history books before Malachor's ancestors had even learned to crawl. But those boosters were pushing masses of iron at percentages of light speed that shouldn't have been possible without gravitic drives. It turned out that the humans hadn't been trying to catch up to the hegemony's elegance. They had been perfecting the art of the throw. 40 years ago, the annexation of Calum 4 had seemed like a bureaucratic formality. Malachor himself had stood before the Great Spire and mocked the primitives who still communicated via radio waves. He had broadcast the hegemony's arrival on every frequency the humans owned, a grand display of propaganda designed to cow them into submission. He had detailed the specifications of their energy shields, the frequency of their pulse arrays, and the invincibility of their harmonic dampeners. He wanted them to know exactly how superior their new masters were. Ironically, he had handed them the blueprints for his own grave. The humans didn't surrender. They went quiet. For 4 decades, the Calum system became a black hole of information. No signals left the atmosphere. No ships ventured past the asteroid belt. The hegemony assumed they were cowering, perhaps regressing into a dark age of terror as they awaited the inevitable arrival of the Grand Punitive Armada. Truth is, Calum 4 was no longer a planet. It was a fortress with a heartbeat. As the Armada drifted past the orbit of the 5th moon, the trap snapped shut. It wasn't a laser grid or a tractor beam. It was a cloud. Millions of proximity-fused kinetic mines, cold and invisible to thermal sensors, had been sewn into the Lagrange points. They didn't emit energy. They just waited. When the hegemony's ships moved through them, the mines didn't explode against the shields. They simply stayed in the way. The Obsidian Sovereign shuddered again. A secondary impact sheared off the port sensor array. Malachor felt the vibration in his bones, a low, rhythmic thrumming that spoke of mechanical failure and venting atmosphere. His officers were screaming about shield integrity, but the shields were fine. The energy fields were shimmering at 100% efficiency, ready to deflect any plasma bolt or disruptor beam. But the shields were designed to stop light and heat. They weren't designed to stop a block of iron moving at 20,000 kilometers per second. They didn't match our light speed tech. They broke it with iron. And then the radio crackled. After 40 years of silence, a single human voice cut through the static on the bridge. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a manifesto. It was a series of coordinates. The coordinates weren't for a parley. They were for an impact. Malachor watched the tactical overlay as the numbers synced with the trajectory of the Obsidian Sovereign. The humans weren't just firing at the fleet. They were leading them into a slaughterhouse they had spent 40 years building. They had turned a solar system into a grave, and the hegemony was drifting into it with the momentum of its own arrogance. A third slug, larger than the previous 2, struck the midsection of the flagship. The sound was a rhythmic, metallic thud that resonated through the deck plates, vibrating in Malachor's talons. It wasn't the clean sizzle of a thermal lance. It was the raw, unrefined sound of something being crushed. The atmospheric seal in the secondary reactor room failed, and the scream of venting air was a haunting, high-pitched whistle that no dampener could silence. Truth is, the hegemony had forgotten the physics of the physical. They had lived in the realm of light and frequency for so long that they had forgotten the sheer stubborn power of mass. The human voice on the radio spoke again, calm and devoid of the theatricality Malachor had used in his own broadcasts. Aegis Hube, this is Calum Ground. You are currently transitioning into the dead zone. We suggest you check your aft sensors. Malachor turned. On the main view screen, the sun of the Calum system was flickering, not because it was dying, but because something massive was passing in front of it. It wasn't a ship, it was a redirected moonlet, its surface scarred with the scorch marks of thousands of nuclear pulse engines. It was moving on a collision course with the heart of the Armada, a multi-billion-ton hammer aimed at the hegemony's glass crown. The high prelate felt a cold, stinging sensation behind his eyes. He realized then that the primitive solid-fuel boosters hadn't been a sign of a failing civilization. There were a choice. The humans knew that if they built a civilization out of light, it could be dimmed. So they built one out of iron and gravity. "Evasive maneuvers," Malachor roared, but his voice broke. The obsidian sovereign tried to pivot, its gravitic drives humming with a desperate, frantic energy. But the kinetic slugs had already compromised the structural integrity of the hull. As the ship groaned against the turn, the midsection buckled. The flagship snapped. It didn't explode in a fireball. It simply tore in two, the internal atmosphere rushing out like a final weary sigh. As Malachor drifted in the flickering emergency lights of the bridge, he saw the rest of the Armada falling. The elegant, obsidian spires of the hegemony ships were being shattered by the crude, relentless geometry of the human strikes. There was no glory in it, no martial music, just the silent, brutal efficiency of a species that had learned how to kill gods with rocks. The survivors who managed to limp away from the Calum system carried the story back to the Aegis hub, but it was a story of silence. The humans didn't pursue. They didn't invade. They simply established a 50-light-year perimeter and went dark once more. The hegemony, its invincibility shattered and its primary fleet reduced to scrap, began to crumble from within. Other sectors, seeing the gods bleed iron, began to rise. But no one dared cross the border of the Calum system. It became a ghost story whispered in the halls of dying empires, a warning that the universe is vast, and some of the things living in the dark haven't forgotten how to fight with their hands. Terra sat at the center of that silence, a fortress with a heartbeat, waiting for anyone foolish enough to wake it up again.